So welcome to the Danube Institute. We have an exciting discussion here today, a lecture first and then a discussion by Professor Max Otte. He's an investment manager, an economist, and in the last German presidential election, 2022, he came in second. Professor Otte is also the co-founder of the Spengler Foundation. He is a well-known public intellectual in Germany and outside of Germany in the international realm. One interesting fact about your biography is that you, in 2006, published a book titled "The Crash is Coming." So 2 years before the crash actually came, which gave you a bit of a legendary status in Germany. And Professor Otte is here with us today in the Danube Institute in Budapest. We're very, very glad to have you here, Professor Otte. And I'll give the floor to Professor Otte on the topic of financial capitalism from a Spenglerian perspective.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. It's been 15 years since I was in Budapest. I had Hungarian friends in Princeton. They took different paths, and it was one of those Hungarian centers in the US, like Chicago. And when we had parties, it was always the wildest ones with the Hungarians. And we had to put in fresh air into the house for 2 weeks before the smoke cleared. But they were good parties, I must say. So indeed, this is a more academic discussion, or more, let's say, a discussion about the history of thought, but with very, very relevant connections to today. I mean, the Spengler is so topical today that sometimes predictions are almost eerie. And I will talk about a number of points. I have up to 6 points here, but we're probably not going to go through all of them. I'll introduce the Spengler Society briefly. I talk a bit about Spengler, and then about financial capitalism from a Spenglerian perspective, which actually, if one looks, for example, at Prussianism and socialism, one could put this next to a book by the title "The Collapse of Global Liberalism," and you will see quite a few parallels to that book, Philip. So, I mean, this perspective is a very interesting and perspective that I think will gain prominence and recognition in the coming years, because nowadays it's all still capitalism and Hayek and freedom. And let's put it this way, I was affiliated with the Institute for Humane Studies for a while as a student. I went to their seminars. But libertarianism is the fashion of the day for many, and I think it leads in the wrong direction. But maybe we can touch upon some of these things in the lecture. So in 2008-9, I got media prominence, which lasted until 2016, when I started becoming more critical of policies in Germany. So from famous to infamous, one could say, in that sense. And in 2011, I gave myself the task as an intellectual hobby to test what is true of the late Spengler in terms of current knowledge, because the late Spengler was more of a sociobiologist. He was interested in prehistory, in how mankind evolved and became the humanity we have now. So he was more interested in those topics starting after 24, when he was still politically somewhat active. So the Spengler Society started out of this interest for my, let's say, the philosopher who really made a difference in my youth. I read the whole thing when I was 15, and after that, nothing was the same, I must say, because it really gave me perspective on things. I started with Otte y Gasset, which is also good and easy read, but also quite deep. And then pretty quickly came Spengler, and that informed many decisions in my life. For example, the one to emigrate to the United States, to establish myself there, and then to come back to Germany. That perspective was always there. So in 2011, I thought, what is about the late Spengler and his interest in prehistory. And of course, prehistory has done has made amazing progress in the past couple of decades. I mean, we know so much about how humankind evolved now, about migration and so on and so forth. So we founded the Spengler. So in 2014, I did a conference with the University of Innsbruck, and we actually have an 800 and 900 page conference volume published by Springer. Robert Rollinger, ancient historian, did this conference. I sponsored it. This was on the occasion of my 50th birthday. And then in 2018, we founded the Spengler Society. Michael Töndl from Innsbruck and David Engels and myself. And there's a website, it's oswaldspenglersociety.com. And it's just a purely academic society. We have maybe one conference every 2 years. We give a Spengler Award to outstanding personalities. We were lucky to have Michel Houellebecq accept the first Spengler Award in 2018. You still can find all the speeches on the net. I mean, they're for specialist audience, so they're not really, they don't have a wide audience. So Michel Houellebecq took the first one. We were quite honored. Then we gave the second one in 20 to Walter Scheidel of Stanford, an Austrian historian, one of the few who still teach universal history. So Walter Scheidel wrote this book, The Great Leveler. It says inequality historically has only been abolished or mitigated by war, famine, viruses, or other catastrophes. And that makes inequality breeds inequality. I mean, if you have a class that is skillful at handling money, it's the same in capitalism. I mean, capitalism doesn't breed equality. I mean, it exacerbates inequality, and there's no way out of this except very radical solutions. So Scheidel was the second one. The third one was Jordan Peterson in 22, and in 24 we gave the prize to young bloggers on the internet. One was called The Culture Critic on X. People may know him, or he's now The Culturist, and the other ones were Thinking West. So they came to my country house and we had a nice ceremony. You find all the stuff on the internet, but you have to dig a bit because there's not a big audience for it. So that's the Spengler Society, and we're still very private, very small, but of course you're welcome to join. I mean, it's about 60 people. And we prefer it to be that way, completely independent, completely academic, a society in the best sense of the word, as it used to be. So Spengler himself had a solitary life. I mean, I won't go into his biographical details. He was the quintessential bachelor, mother problems, of course, and psychological stuff floating around and so on and so forth. But there's really 4 Spenglers, which people don't realize. There's the Spengler of Decline of the West, the culture theorist. And that's what he's known for mostly nowadays. But he started out as in late high school, writing a drama about Montezuma. So he was interested in the end of cultures and sudden tragic ends and stuff. And that, let's say, style of being a dramaturgist carries on into his writing. And it helps his writing. I mean, his writing is logically very precise and very concise, but it's also very dramatical. But it's not drama without content. So those things blend very well. So he started out because he had an uncle that was a theater director. That thing got rejected. It got translated into English by an American by the name of John David Ebert, E-B-E-R-T, like our first president in the Weimar Republic. But Ebert is a freelance intellectual, bit younger than me, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I just visited him 2 weeks ago, and he's really been off mainstream academia all his life because he quit after his bachelor, but he translated Montezuma, and he just translated the notes of the late Spengler on becoming humankind. It's called Primordial Questions, Urfragen. So which are the first questions about becoming human? So there was the dramaturgist, there's the cultural theorist, there's the political theorist and political analyst, which is unjustifiedly played down. Brilliant political analysis. I'm going to touch a bit upon them. And there's the late Spengler interested in sociology, prehistory, sociobiology, and what about the species of humankind, what shapes and what forms them. So, I mean, the basic idea of Spengler is that there's patterns to history and that we have cultures, and cultures have four phases. More or less the early phase when it is just starting to form. Then we have the medieval phases, nobility, blood bonds, feudalism, loyalty, more that kind of structure. Then we move into the first cities, and then there is the late culture already, which is the big city and eventually the world city, which is the age of democracy and capitalism and money, which is the same in every culture. And then in the end, the final stage is the final shape or form a culture will take is democracy will die, the questions will become irrelevant, there will be Caesarism. I mean, there will be the reign of an absolute principle. That he predicted for some time around 2000 for our culture. That's basically his theory, and of course he's been attacked for being deterministic. But I mean, what, as my friend David Engels says, what if we don't see patterns in history and try to discern them and try to apply them? Of course, history is open to a certain extent, but Spengler would say it's not really open. There's certain things that have to happen. Which shape they take is a different thing, like the end of democracy will have to happen, but the question is how. So, of course, not everything is predetermined. Hitler was not predetermined. Napoleon was not. Wellington was not. These are coincidences, but there's a general shape of events. So let's dive into Spengler and financial capitalism. Spengler was forgotten for a while. In the 80s, we had a Spengler Renaissance in Germany to some extent. But Adorno in 1949 said, Oswald Spengler has been forgotten with the speed of the catastrophe into which, according to his own doctrine, world history is about to pass. Hardly anyone ever even took notice of his death 14 years ago. And then he said, the forgotten Spengler had his revenge by being right. So Adorno on Spengler. So there's actually, we have, I think we've assembled everything that's been written about Spengler. So, I mean, the Spengler Society purpose is, of course, on the one hand, to assemble what's been written about him and to preserve his memory, but on the other hand, to have academic discourse about human evolution, about world history in a Spenglerian perspective. So it's not all about Spengler himself. So it's about those issues and topics. So, I mean, he has a grandiose style, and in his foreword he writes, and now we have somewhat of a renaissance, and we've had books like Spengler, a Thinker at the Turning Point, or Oswald Spengler as a pan-European phenomenon, Tectonics of Systems, New Readings of Spengler, Oswald Spengler in a Universal Historical Perspective, or his youth diary entries were published. Montezuma was published in English, in German, now in English. And Spengler claimed to have this Copernican revolution by looking at patterns, by looking at how civilization, how cultures evolve. And again, I mean, from history's side, one could criticize it for being too grandiose and so on and so forth. But the breakthrough in artificial intelligence was when AI abandoned logic and moved to pattern recognition. That was the breakthrough. Get rid of logic, just try to see patterns. And that's what Spengler does in some ways. So, I mean, he writes, in this book, an attempt is made for the first time to predetermine history. The task is to trace the destiny of culture, namely the only one that is today in the process of reaching completion on this planet, the Western European American, in stages that have not yet run their course. I mean, that's quite an ambitious undertaking. But he did overcome Eurocentrism. Of course, he's being by the wrong people denounced as being Nazi, but he was very anti-Nazi. I mean, the Nazis were too socialist in the modern sense. I mean, he put a different meaning on the word socialist, but they were too, let's say, plebeian for a proletarian for him. But he overcame Eurocentrism. He, after his last book in '33, refused to write anything, burned the second volume of his notes on world politics because he said he's not writing for censorship. So he basically withdrew to private life in the last 3 years of his life. He was offered 2 professorships by the Nazis. He declined both. So certainly he was quite opposed to Nazism. He predicted the end of universal conscription by the year around 2000, which remarkably fits with Germany, for example, although we're discussing getting it back, but probably we now have conscripts then not from Germany, but from other parts of the world. That's the current strategy as I see it. He foresaw or predicted democracy coming to an end around the same time. The emergence of a world empire, we can discuss this because we really have the competition between the US bloc and the Chinese bloc. He feared in 1924, in his reconstruction of the German Reich, he said, who would think that the rise of the new caliphate is possible? And at that time, I mean, Islam was on its knees. There was nothing. And he said, but this could be possible. I mean, this was 1924. He was the first to really talk about environmental degradation. So, I mean, quite a few quite amazing predictions. He anticipated a colored world revolution. He saw second religiousness emerging. At the end of each culture, he says there's a second religiousness. And the, let's say, very intellectual city culture gets tired and people just want to have deep religious truths. He feared in 1931 in Men and Technics the diffusion of Western technology to other countries, to emerging nations. And I wrote, must one not call such a thinker a seer? Spengler himself would probably not have been averse to this label, considering formulations such as, I have foreseen things as they developed and will continue to develop organically and faithfully. I foresee even more, but I feel lonelier than ever. Or I think as a person who was destined through his own seeing and understanding to represent his age symbolically. I mean, of course, this self-confidence also marks some insecurities and so on through his personal life. But indeed, he had his revenge by being right in many things. So let's talk about financial capitalism in the context of Spengler's cycle model. I have very small print here, so I have to fight a bit with the print. By the way, this is I wrote this 8 years ago, but it's just been translated into English by this John Ebert from New Mexico. So it's now available in English. I can send it to you as a PDF, or you can have it. You can also have the Oswald Spengler and Sociobiology. These things are available in English these days.
Is it published yet?
No, it's not published.
Both of them?
Both of them are not. I see when I can get to it. I still have to run 4 companies. I mean, not daily, but it's still some work. I'm trying to hand over responsibilities, which works, but not always. So I'm not totally free intellectual at this point. And I had the aftermath of the presidential elections, which cost quite a lot of business. So, but still, I'm working on it. So we talked about the cultural cycles. Financial capitalism merely represents the specific form of monetary thinking in late Western culture. Similar phenomena appeared in the late periods of other cultures as well. For example, in the late Roman Republic or the earlier imperial times, you had speculations, you had large grain speculations, you had interest, you had we had something like joint stock companies even. So this was a late stage in Roman. It means to think everything in monetary terms. And of course, a house is something very different as seen by a venture capitalist or private equity guy or an engineer or an architect or a renter or an art historian. So, I mean, it's an abstract category. And capitalism, money thinking is just a shape, a way of thinking. It's not in itself real. I mean, it's a system which we use. Maybe even an epistemological system, but a system of perceiving reality. So in feudal stages, you'd have little money. David Graeber, who was the Occupy icon about in, let's say, 2009, 2010, wrote a book called Debt. I mean, this was a movement against Wall Street. The younger people here may not remember it. This is at least 17 years ago. So Graeber wrote this book, Debt, the Last 5,000 Years. So he asked a simple question: what was there first, money or debt? Of course, it was debt. Because in the village, I mean, you exchanged. I mean, you slaughtered a pig, you gave this to him, and this, you divided it, and at some point you collected a favor back. So money is a late phenomenon, even in world history. I mean, this is like 1000 BC, the Axis times, when it really appeared for the first time. And money is nothing that economists tell you was invented for its practicality. So we can have just one exchange ratio, and I don't have to exchange, let's say, some part of the pork for some tailoring or whatever, and then I have to go around and do more exchanges. So economic theory says, okay, money is there to simplify exchanges, which is true, but that was not the reason it started. And they have to go back to the German state-centered economists of the late 19th, earliest 20th century, like Laum or Knapp, Friedrich Georg Knapp. They've written books. Money was imposed from above. The temples needed taxes. You had to pay standing armies. So money was nothing bottom up. It was top down. Like all kinds of power exercise in some ways are top down. So money is a relatively late phenomenon in world history, but also in every culture. Because the early culture is feudal, individual exchanges, debt, obligation. I mean, when your lord called upon you to serve and go to battle, you went to battle. And I mean, this was not via taxes. This was via personal loyalty. And then you have the rising cities. I mean, in the Occident, it was northern Italy mostly, and then England a little later. Germany was later, but some in southern Germany. And then you have the age of money and democracy, which are synonymous to Spengler, which is, let's say, around the time of Napoleon till around now. So he says the money system in that shape will collapse. And then it will be replaced by increasingly economic, increasingly primitive forms of economic exchange, or increasingly power-dominated forms of economic exchange. We see that in US foreign policy right now. I mean, it's, well, you do that, otherwise I come in and do something. I mean, they've been doing it to some extent all the time, but now it's very, very outspoken, very obvious, very, very, very clear. At first, people possessed wealth because they held power. Now they hold power because they possess money. Only money raises the intellect to the throne. Democracy represents the completed equation of money and political power. So he also says it's wrong, as Marx says, to see the decisive period of modern capitalism in the first half of the 19th century, so the capitalism rising, the machine culture rising. He said it's right before Napoleon, when ownership became more anonymous. He said, in the age of Frederick the Great, you could have flown across Europe and you've seen factories and people doing stuff, but you could identify the owner. And after that, you saw pretty much the same thing, but ownership was increasingly anonymous. Well, this is so true then as it is now. No one knows how much of German industry belongs to Germany. The changes from one stock exchange date to next. It is therefore no longer the case, as Marx presents it, out of the need to provide a theoretical foundation for class struggle, that a natural opposition exists between employers and employees. Today, the opposition exists far more between those people who perform visibly productive work, whether as leaders or led as entrepreneurs, technicians, or workers, and the much smaller, constantly changing number of unknown individuals who are neither one or the other, but who own the enterprise, for whom the work is done, even though they know nothing about the nature of that work. And of course, if you look at Germany, we had a renationalization in the Kaiserreich, and it only broke up, actually it was a socialist, a social democratic person who broke it up, Oskar Lafontaine, the short-term finance minister under Joschka Fischer, and social democracy and financial capitalism are good allies. I mean, so Germany was rather closed after the war, what we called the Germany Inc., the Deutschland AG, but of course this changed under the assault of Anglo-Saxon financial capitalism. The same was Japan. When I was studying in Princeton from 89 to 92, after that I wrote my dissertation, the prime concern was, when is Japan overtaking us? We have to open up the Japanese retail system. It's so outdated. It's so anachronistic. But I mean, the mom and pop stores. But those mom and pop stores provided real social capital. Those people were responsible. They knew about their products. This was not any anonymous large chains and systems. I mean, so it was a good system. I mean, you couldn't just measure it purely financial because the social benefits. So that was the concern then, because Ezra Vogel had written Japan as number one in 1979. And so that Americans are very concerned about being number one. And it's a catastrophe if they're not number one in any respect. I mean, I have an American citizenship from my time there, but I guess I do feel a bit more German still. But and of course, when I started my first assistant professorship in Princeton, it was, I held a guest lecture. This was in April, or my job talk was in April 1998 about the euro and the future of the European Union. And I got some things pretty right and some things terribly wrong. So I said, the euro will have problems in 10 years because it's not economically sound. And I gave the argument and so on. I was one of the few Eurosceptics at the time, or no, there were more, but in Germany there was a letter also by some professors signed by 150 actually, but said in 10 years the system will run into big difficulties. It took 12, but then the system was in deep trouble. And then I said, then the euro will collapse. Brussels will collapse in its current shape and we'll get a decent European whatever construct. So the second part, of course, I was quite wrong because the elites escalated and did things that I didn't think would be possible at the time. But so then even when I made this job talk, my American colleagues were quite happy to see that there's going to be troubles for you to euro, so I got the job. But that also was my opinion. So, and then he says, at the end of the democratic capitalist era, there's a few global cities that dominate everything. Everything else becomes province. At that time, it could still be Berlin and New York. And nowadays, I mean, where are the decisions being made? I mean, there's through skillful diplomacy, and Hungary has done very well at this. You can get a certain amount of independence and a certain room for maneuver for your own path. But the big decisions, New York, Washington, maybe Silicon Valley, Beijing, to a lesser extent than Moscow, maybe, but there's not so many places, certainly not Berlin. certainly not Paris anymore, although Macron, of course, deeply deplores that. But London, to a certain extent, yes. They had the brains, the US had the muscles, but that model is falling apart too. So it's really a handful of, he writes about a handful of cities that in the late stages of capitalism are really the centers of decision. And if one follows Spengler's scheme, we already stand at the threshold of the final age of Western culture, that of Caesarism, in which naked force increasingly reasserts itself as a means of politics, and Trump is following this course. I mean, we'll see how successful or how transformative this will be. Maybe he is the first Caesar. And in which the complex forms of late civilization increasingly fall prey to the predatory instincts of private claims. With this, legal certainty ends, and violence takes its place, and thinking in monetary categories slowly fades. This could be between 2000 and 2100 if one looks at from Spengler's. And here's how was his view shaped? When I talk about Spengler as a sociobiologist or somebody interested in human evolution, we have to look a bit about his path. I mean, he did write a doctorate, he did write a master's thesis, he wrote his master's thesis on the development of the human eye, so the biological thesis, and the doctorate on Heraclitus, so a philosophical topic. And he skipped classes. I mean, it was a very good school, the Hallische Stiftung in Halle. By the way, if you ever go to that part, I mean, there's a lot of Bronze Age history in Middle Germany. And the University of Halle is one of the most underrated because there's hardly anybody there. They have the sky disk of Nebra and lots of prehistoric stuff. It's really good, and it's really pretty empty. So it's a good trip. So he was there at the Frankische Stiftungen, and he skipped classes to go to the library, to the public library, to read Haeckel and Darwin and the evolutionary theorists. So he has a lot of biological knowledge of natural science. That's where he gets his theory of science from. So he blends all that stuff. So basically, he has a socio-biological view. Let's see here. This is Vuketitz. This is an Austrian sociobiologist. Individuals and cultures strive for security and dominance. You could also take this from realist political theory. Some more, some others less. In the end, cultures and individuals pursue power. Fittest expand their sphere of influence. This dynamic reflects the Darwinian struggle for existence. Spengler describes this drives with the terms life and blood. I mean, this is his chiffre for sociobiology has shown that altruism can also function as a meaningful mechanism in this context. So altruism is not ruled out by sociobiology. I mean, just one example of his poetic style, just to see, and this is in relation to this sociobiological view of humans or history and so on. The plant owns the soil in which it takes root. The soil belongs to it, and it defends it with desperation throughout its entire existence against foreign seeds, against overpowering neighboring plants, against nature as a whole. In the same way, a bird defends the nest in which it broods. The fiercest struggles over property do not take place in the late phases of great cultures, nor between rich and poor over movable goods. They occur here at the beginnings of the plant world. Anyone who stands in the middle of a forest and senses the silent struggle for the soil unfolding all around, day and night, without mercy, feels horror at the depth of this drive, which almost merges with life itself. So, I mean, here's a poet, but so competition, he sees this as competition. Technology also, he says technology is not something specific to humans. I mean, ants have technology, birds have nest-building technology, but for animal species, it's generic. For the species, it's either in the genes or it's acquired over many generations. Humans can willfully design technology, invent technology, go about this. I will probably end pretty quickly. Let me just, of course, he criticizes modern economics, and me too. The standpoint from which one can understand the economic history of high cultures cannot arise from economics itself. Economic thinking and action form one aspect of life. This aspect falls into false light as soon as one treats this as an independent form of life. One finds this standpoint least of all within today's world economy, which over the past 150 years has undergone a fantastic, dangerous, and ultimately almost desperate rise. This rise remains exclusively Western and dynamical and lacks any claim to universal history. Well, our way of doing business is spread. He has also foreseen this, but he says it's still intrinsic to the Western soul. The others have copied it. So maybe this, financial capitalism, the last principle of the West, what we today call economics, rests entirely on specific English assumptions. From Smith to Marx, he says Marx is an English theorist, as are the Austrians, by the way. Hayek is a very English thinker. It amounts to nothing more than the self-analysis of the economic thinking of a single culture at a single stage. He says the West will have one final principle, and we could call it return on investment, which is the amount you get per capital employed. And that's what private equity and all this, and Philip and I have discussed this, that we have a highly financialized, almost a rentier's economy, where those private equity captains and basically dictate what's going to happen. And it's not a productive system, but it's an ideology. It's an ideology that pervades lots of our economy. And to finish, maybe, I thought about, what are the economics departments? And in 2013, I was in a discussion with heterodox economists at the University of Graz, where I had a professorship for 5 years. And the young German dean had the audacity to invite some non-orthodox economists. And the students loved it, and he was devastated at the end. This will set us back for years. And so I told him, please teach them the history of economic thought, give them a historical perspective. No, we do that in the PhD programs. For the young ones, we have to do microeconomics and macroeconomics and set the foundations. So it's really a doctrine. It's not a science. It's an ideology. And so, forgive me, Father, I call the economics faculties the pre-seminars of modern capitalism, and the business schools, the officer schools. They all think alike in the business schools. Those are that we train a cast of officers and a cast of priests of financial capitalism. And I guess I end here.
Professor Otte, before we go to the Q&A and open up the discussion to everyone here, I wanted to ask you one or two questions about the state of our perhaps bipolar financial world. Mm-hmm. You spoke about there being a Western pole and there being a Chinese pole. And it's interesting, we had here at the Danube Institute a professor named Jian Shuitong, who is a leading political scientist from China. And he had the exact argument that you can say that the world is multipolar. You can distinguish all kinds of poles. You can say that Myanmar is a pole. You can make them as small as you want. But if you're talking about comprehensive poles, where you truly have an entire way of thinking about politics and the economy, an entire civilizational legacy, and true weight militarily and geopolitically on the world stage, you're talking the West and specifically America, and you're talking China, and not the European Union, which doesn't have a military, so it will not be a comprehensive pool. So we agree on that basic basic formatting of our 21st century world. Now, where would Spengler fit in? Because Spengler is an enormously powerful thinker, and in an event like this, it's hard to get away from Spengler because he's such an attractive and powerful figure that it's very tempting to only speak about Spengler in Munich in the early 21st century, because in the early 20th century, because that is so interesting in its own right. But of course, we want to know, what does the Spenglerian perspective bring in the 21st century? So you spoke about Spengler describing finance capital as not the natural form of the economy as such, but a specific form of Western civilization, the late stage of Western civilization. Yes. You talked about, and Spengler wrote about, the economy being very much a way of thinking. First of all, you have a specific form of life, expressing itself through the economy. So now, if you look at America and you look at China, we see, however, a very different relationship to finance. Now, this is and you've said in an earlier videoed event, I'm not sure exactly where it was, but you have a very big presence on social media, and I saw a clip come by where you said that around the middle of the 21st century, you'll see the dominance shifting from the West to China. Now, if you look at China and seeing what it does in technology and industrial capitalism, it seems that that's the direction we're going. You see the Chinese rising up also in education. You see a certain educational dominance arising, an academic dominance, a patents dominance. They're driving innovation, they're driving industry. However, the Chinese Communist Party is very hesitant about finance capitalism. And they have a new slogan. Well, I'm not sure how new it is, but I've come across it recently. It's where they said, we want finance to flourish, but we don't want internal circulation. So they want finance to serve the economy under their directorship as socialists, and they do not want it to have much of its own dynamism. Then I'm thinking, how would that play out when there would in fact be a transition from one to the predominance of one civilization to the other, or one form of life to the other? Because that would mean, how would that play out? Because when you had Britain, the British Empire, giving way to the American Empire, there was a little bit of friction in the middle of the 20th century. There was some political tensions, but it was a relatively smooth operation because they were very similar empires coming from having the same civilizational rooting. Because you had London standing in the center of the British Empire. It ran a surplus, it ran a deficit with its colonies, but much of the money that was made in the colonies was reinvested, was recycled via London banks. Right. So and of course it was the pound sterling that was the dominant currency in the world, and there were the Brits and perhaps also a little bit the French that were guarding the sea routes. Now America took over that role after the 1945 gradually, and then you see the finance capital moving from London to New York, but London was still there. But now, if it would move to China, it would move to a very different type of machine. Now, various things can happen. One thing that can happen is that it won't move at all, and China will actually will build a very different world. Another option is that because China will be unwilling to have the dynamism of financial capitalism, it might just miss a certain part. Which would result in China not being able to completely dominate the late 21st century, but instead you will see a structural bipolarity where the West will still have certain features that China will not attain, and then we'll have these different poles existing next to each other for a long time. So how could we make sense on a deeper level of these constellations and of these possible shifts and of the different scenarios that may unfold from a Spenglerian perspective?
Well, I have a full section on the, thank you. I have a full section on the financial systems in the end. Once again, the paper is available. It just came out. I mean, it's not out. It's not published, but you have it. And so is the system bank-based or is it stock exchange-based? And finance has to serve the economy. Those are very German sentences. I mean, and so we had our new economy, our founding boom after the unification of the Reich in 1873 to 1876. Thousands of joint stock companies shot up. And then very quickly, German regulators realized we need many decentralized banks. Richard Werner talks about this. And we just have to have the stock exchange in a serving and supplementary role. In the Anglo systems is the other way. We have the stock exchange dominating and the banks in a very subservient supplementary role. And so that system in Germany worked well until the 90s. And then, of course, it became dismantled because in the early 90s, as a former Undersecretary of Defense told me, who had been in the Bundestag for 40 years, even in 91, the US switched from partnership to total competition. I mean, economic competition. So very early on. And now basically the old system is gone. I mean, there's a few relics. And so I think the Chinese have noticed that. They're quite smart. And so in some sense, what was then was the competition between the German and the British systems when he wrote his Prussianism and Socialism at the same time as Decline of the West, 1919. And it fits into a number of books like Heroes and Traders by Sombart and so on. So that's this big, or the culture in the spiritual life of the peoples. There's another one. I mean, this is World War I influence, obviously, but there's this systemic competition or clash. And of course, we have it now. But what I think is the most likely scenario, and I had in 2018, when I published World System Crash, 640 pages, was 14 weeks on the bestseller list, although I was out of the media at the time. So it was still pretty prominent. Media did its best not to notice it, but it was there. So I had three scenarios on page 398 for the future. I said this scenario one is a new Cold War. We have a Chinese center and a Western center. We have two blocks. And we have a Europe pretty much subservient to the US and pretty much integrated into the US. So Europe is the US sphere. With some independent sub-centers like China or Russia. Status open, I said at the time. And in between it thought we're driving Russia completely into China's direction, but now there's some openness again, but we'll see. But basically we have a new bipolar world and two systems. And that's happening. I mean, China is decoupling. They've sold half of their 1.2 trillion US Treasury holdings over the past 3 years. So we're down to 600 billion. And they're buying oil and gold and copper and all kinds of things for it at any price because they know that the dollar is worthless. So the second would be, unfortunately, big war, which is not out of the question. I mean, the catastrophe is not averted. I mean, there's sometimes we're closer to it, sometimes a little less close. But the third one would be a multipolar, but not really multipolar. I mean, it would be like Chinese, the US, a European entity, whatever shape it has. And that, of course, was my dream scenario, but I said that's highly unlikely. So what can I say? So we have a competition of those systems. And we see, of course, also because the US is breaking most of its own rules by confiscating illegally foreign reserves, by imposing trade sanctions, which is economic warfare. I was at the Institute for International Economics as a very young intern, 21 years old. Now it's called the Peterson Institute, I think, in Washington, 11 DuPont Circle, when two economists, Jeffrey Scott and Gary Clyde Hofbauer, wrote a big book, 700 pages, Economic Sanctions Reconsidered. This was in 1986, maybe. And they basically did a cookbook for economic sanctions, for CIA, whatever involvement, how to destroy a country, how to impose sanctions. So they had basically sanctions work best against the weak. If you have to do it, you have to go in full force. All kinds of things they had basically as a recipe there. So with those sanctions, of course, I mean, Western Europeans are pretty dependent on Europe now with the tariffs and so on. This thing is, and Trump is very outspoken on this and very, let's say, fearless and all. Probably also he just says those things, and then Europeans have some opportunity to reflect. If it's any good, we will see. But so that order is dissolving, and it will be either replaced by power relationships vis-a-vis Europe. I mean, destroy Nord Stream and sell the expensive LNG to Germany and get the politicians, especially the green politicians, to vote for LNG terminals and stuff. So that's pure power politics. And the third one is highly unlikely, unfortunately. It would be nice, but the Cold War and the new Cold War and the competition of the systems and the further decoupling of economic blocks, major blocks, with a few, let's say, independent or semi-independent sub-centers, Russia, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Iran if it holds, maybe to some extent Hungary and Germany if it can be the new Switzerland. That's my shape of the world.
First of all, thank you very much, Eric and Callum and the colleagues from Danube for organizing that. Actually, it's a great opportunity that we could meet here. But I have to remind you that Mr. Otte came as a guest of MCC, I have to promote the house, and MKI, Hungarian Institute for International Affairs, and I'm glad that the colleagues from MKI are today with us, actually. So, and I'm basically trying also to announce, to invite you to join us tomorrow with the lecture that will be like proper lecture at MCC and Scruton, and that we are trying to concentrate about competitiveness, actually, today, where Max will be speaking more about, let me say,
oh, you just gave me a new topic. That's good.
Yeah, actually, to remind you, the whole
more
idea
geopolitics.
More geopolitics, and but actually we are organizing the whole series of panels dealing with competitiveness this spring, actually. So that's the first thing. So you're more than welcome to join us tomorrow at 5. And speaking about comments, I'm of course we have very small amount of time generally. So Max presented, like, if I could say, 1/3 maybe, or one half almost, because there is the other part, and I will definitely send to Eric and to some other friends here a PDF so you could distribute onward. There is also normative part and counter part, if I could say, and this is very detailed explanation about the Prussian socialism, which is the book actually that Spengler published after Men and Technique and so on.
No.
Yeah.
In 1919, parallel to Decline of the West, right at the end of the war. It was basically an outgrowth of a Decline of the West.
Yeah. So actually, at the same time, he by criticizing financial capitalism, he offered a model in a way which, as you say, was connected basically with the First World War, general these merchants and warriors thing and so on. Just a couple of things, and I will pass it to the colleagues. First, some, let me say, more information about. I mentioned you that we are organizing in Dubrovnik in September a seminar trying to connect Spengler and Todd. I'm sure you read the book, the last book of Emmanuel Todd. He was guest actually of Danube in, I think, March this year before I came actually here. So it's, I would like you to comment a little bit about that. In a way, he's touching more or less about the same thing about...
yeah, I haven't been to Dubrovnik since April 1991, about 2 months before the bombing started.
So you're welcome to join us and to give the contribution to the book I mentioned and so on. I really think that some part of this could really be very useful for that. First, if you would like a little bit to comment about Emmanuel Todd and how do you see comparison of his work with Spengler? Could you see some connections about that? The other thing is actually, You mentioned when you speak about financial capitalism, we of course remember to Rudolf Hilferding and the famous book from 1911. Also, I would like to make some comment on how Hilferding looks from that perspective, and how do you see that today? And two more things. First, I was mentioning to you this Russian guy, so you could see the book. Actually, this is Serbian edition. This is the book of Nikolai Danilevsky, which is called Russia and Europe, and it is published in 1869 because he was also
cultural theorist.
Yes. Cultural theorist, but actually he was biologist by his basic education. That's very interesting, and he wrote this as an idea of morphology, historical morphology of a different civilization. So many people in Russia will tell you that, like Spengler, took some ideas or maybe the same. By the way, I found actually that Peter M. Sorokin testified that he knows that in 1921, one visitor saw the copy of Russia and Europe. So he's not mentioning Danilevsky in the Decline of the West, but actually he knew for the book, So it's very interesting. It's been published in English in 2013, so you can find the copy. And it's really very interesting thing. And final comment. Because Max is trying to implement actually how the whole we could say financialization of the whole system, actually to make it like comparison with the securitization, because everything is becoming securitized nowadays. But actually how, for example, financialization is destroying the science actually. And there is, by the way, we are all striving to publish into and get very high into the system, which is actually provided by a couple of American corporations who are running the private list, actually.
Yes.
And that's really, I think, fantastic model, because even in Russia, which is, as we all know now, directly or semi-directly in the war with the West, basically they still preserve that kind of system that they are forcing their people to publish into
U.S. journals.
U.S. journals, and the journals that are, valued in the hierarchy of the USA corporations. Actually, thank you very much.
Where do I start? Danilevsky, I've never found a German or English copy of this book. I mean, and it's not, probably Spengler did get his inspiration from him. I mean, he's, as he said, he sees himself as a seer who symbolically sees the big questions of the age and is destined to express them. So he also doesn't quote Sombart, Händler, and Helden, which may have an influence to Prussianism and socialism. So he doesn't quote those people too much. And actually, there's a good book by a French nobleman. It's called The Coming Caesars by Amaury de Riencourt, 1956. And he wrote, I mean, he was a nobleman. He was a leisurely academic, not at a university. And he wrote 5-6 books. And this book is 100% Spengler. And he mentioned Spengler once in the foreword. So, but he traces the development of the U.S. political system from a power perspective, from a party perspective, from a systemic perspective. And he says the first Caesar, of course, was Roosevelt, and then there was a setback. And then in 56, of course, this book stops. So, but this is the same thing, maybe what Spengler did to Danilevsky. So, who knows? But that's okay. For Todd or Hilferding, I'll read them more closely and I get back to you next time.
Please do.
So now I've had Todd on my desk and I've looked into it, and of course it resonated, everything resonated with me, but it's a long book, and as I said, I have a few other jobs, so and I have Hilferding at home, so, but I mean, there's...
Did you read Hilferding?
Not completely, no.
Not completely,
and
okay.
What I read was a long time ago.
It's 1911, for those who are not following. It's the famous social democrat.
Finanzkapital.
Finanzkapital.
He became finance minister after the Kaiserreich for a while.
Still very useful book, I think. So,
And your last point was?
The science.
Oh, of course, the science, yeah. I'll keep this very brief to give others the opportunity. Of course, I mean, it's a terrible development in academia. I quit my tenured position, my lifetime position, 7 years ago. I mean, I was on leave, on unpaid leave since 2008, but I finally quit in 2019. How can you measure productivity and peer review? I mean, this is socialism. This is a planned economy. This is terrible. I mean, and the idea of the academia in former times was, I mean, if you have a professor and you give him a salary for life, and the guy has one good idea in his life, that's worth it. And you have to take the risk of him not having a good idea. But being forced to produce, terrible. But this is how we are destroying ourselves. I mean, basically in a nutshell.
We're turning now to my American colleague Jean, who I'm sure has more detailed question about the Kaiserreich and the 1911. No, I'm joking. He's a former Trump campaign organizer. So I'm thinking we're turning to practical politics now.
Wow.
Yes. Hi, my name is Sean Nodley. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Danube Institute. And yes, I worked for the Trump campaign. Wasn't going to mention that. But I have a question, two quick ones. I want to keep it brief. For Spengler, when he talks about sort of a post-democratic world, the end of democracy, does he foresee, sort of the rise of great dictators and fascism and doing away with the democratic process worldwide? Like, what does he envision as what will happen? Like, what those political systems will look like? And second, real quick, is in Spengler's view, would he view, are we doomed to follow these patterns? Or if we recognize these patterns as a species, as a society, can we sort of change our fate? And can we realize things are trending this way? We can do something now to stop it.
Finish with Spengler would say we're destined to follow, not doomed, but destined. Of course, there's a much different path which is open, is AI, and the destruction of humanity through AI, that is a real danger. I mean, so in that sense, but I voted for Trump 3 times. I mean, and the first time, this was with Armin Wolf, the Austrian reporter-in-chief of the ORF. So this was in the Vienna trade fair, the finance fair in March 2013. And I was on a panel, 500 people there. I was still in favor with the media. And I said, I'm going to vote for Trump. He's my peace president. And there was big laughter in the crowd, and Wolf was making fun of it. And for 8 years he was. But unfortunately, he's abandoned all of that. We could discuss that, what happened here in the past 12 months, basically. I mean, there's some deep stuff going on. But I voted for him 3 times. So Caesarism is the necessary end stage of a culture. Of course, Caesarism, you have real powers behind the scenes. I mean, you enter a new Augustan age where you preserve the old forms. You still have a Senate, you maybe still have a Congress, but I mean, the real powers as they are now, I mean, it's monetary, big forces that move these things. And of course, you pay off your clientele. So and I think it's very helpful to study the late Roman Republic. And he does that brilliantly, of course, only until 1956. Who is paying off whom? What are the factions? I mean, you had those various colors with the parties in the Roman Republic, even in the Augustan age, but then the parties were more about races, one racing against the others, and so on and so forth. So the real decisions maybe get some approval by the masses. But so, yes, you still work to have mass approval, but the decisions are taken elsewhere.
So a symbolic democracy when there's real power, basically the swamp.
Yes,
and
it's not fascism, because fascism, of course, is a corporate state, and Caesarism is the concentration within strong individuals who may change. So it will not be hereditary for a long time. I mean, you could have 2, 3 in a hereditary line at a time, but then somebody else will step in, and so on and so forth. So that is Caesarism for him. And this can last for a long time. I mean, the Roman Empire finally fell around 400 AD, but the Chinese culture lasted for a long time, but it will not develop anymore. It will not evolve. This is the final shape, he says, and so that's at least his reading of things.
We have various questions. We turn first to my Brazilian colleague, Stefano. We'll take the fluffy thing.
Thank you very much. My name is Stefano Hockey. I'm also a visiting fellow here at Danube. My question is more regarding, I would say, a more academic aspect of Spengler. I've noticed, also from what I've read of him, the theme of decline of our civilization is very strong in him. So I'm curious about how, if at all, did he deal with the other current that arose more or less at the same time that dealt with the decline of the West, which was perennialism and traditionalism, specifically the Guénonian, Evolian tradition. As I know that, for example, Rudolf Steiner was very critical of Spengler because he was an evolutionary.
Yes.
But I have read last year a book by Walter Heinrich, the student of Ottmar Spahn, in which when he was talking about Guénon and Evola, he would occasionally mention Spengler as using him as a comparative tool. So I'm curious, how does Spenglerism compare with this more Franco-Italian perennialism, and how, if at all, did he debate with both these thinkers and with Ottmar Spahn? Thank you.
Of course, Spahn was the quintessential corporatist, tragic figure. So Spengler would have had sympathy for him. I don't think there was any connection, but there was certainly quite some parallel thinking. Same with Evola. But for Steiner, he would have said, those are the fads of a late age. Those are substitute religions. Those are not the real religions. And all kinds of fads will pop up in arts, in mysticism, in those things. So that is, for him, the fad or the fashion of a late intellectual era. Is that a brief, short answer that would answer it?
Yes.
Okay.
Norbert?
Es freut mich, Sie kennenzulernen. Aber jetzt, I switch to English.
Yes, I can't switch to Hungarian.
Norbert is my Hungarian colleague.
Okay.
Yeah, Hungarian colleague. I'm a military scientist. So my question is not exactly related to Spengler.
But Spengler had deep thoughts on military too.
Yes.
Yeah.
But you have spoken about the scenarios. So
About?
Scenarios, the
Yes.
3 scenarios. And my question is, so how do you see the BRICS pay system? So is it a real alternative for switching the SWIFT system, so bypass the US-led dollar monetary system? And in what stage is this realization of the BRICS pay system? And the last mention, so the Trump's constant tariff policy, we can say, is slow or accelerate this process? This is my question.
Well, of course, it will accelerate the process, but I come to that later. So, of course, the move towards BRICS, BRICS, but really, if you think about hegemonic stability theory, Charles Kindleberger, who actually had the pleasure of meeting in 1986, the theorist, he was at the German desk in World War II, after World War II, he wrote the things about financial crisis. And he died in 2003, I think, so lived a pretty long life. Funny, very funny lecture, good, brilliant economic historian. For the world economy to be stable, there needs to be a stabilizer. The hegemonic stability theory the world in depression. So obviously, the global stabilizer, the global hegemon was the UK, then it became the US. And there will not be a BRICS as a truly mode type. It will be a Chinese system, but many of the BRICS will pivot to China because the US has lost credibility through its unilateralism and through its illegal actions, basically, to further its own interests. So that shift is going to happen. If it's going, when and how fast, I mean, we see things being done in Saudi Arabia. They're paying not only in dollars now. We see a number of substitute systems. I have no idea. I mean, there's a lot of ifs, and it's a tricky question. If it's going to happen, what the reaction of the US will be. So we're in the process right now. The global reserve share of the dollar has declined from 70% 20, 25 years ago to 55%. So it's still over 50. It might happen very quickly. It might have happened. I mean, those transition periods are difficult to predict. At the end, most likely there will be a Chinese currency block and a Western currency. I mean, the euro will lose significance. Hopefully, it will collapse. Who knows? In 2009, I was in a panel in Krynica in Poland. I told the Vice Prime Minister, please keep the zloty. And he was looking at me a bit strangely, but I think they're pretty happy now. They still have the zloty, but who knows what's going to happen. So it's difficult to predict. It's certainly things are happening. And of course, Trump's, let's say, erratic tariff policy is accelerating it. Tariffs by themselves are nothing bad. I mean, Friedrich List, the great economist, or Alexander Hamilton, who influenced List. I mean, List is a tragic story. I mean, Spengler writes about List as being a great, tragic German who had been forgotten, maybe in his time. Afterwards, in Nazi Germany, of course, he got more attention. And then there's only 2 Oswald Spengler streets in Germany, but there's quite a few Friedrich List streets still. So he was back for a while. So tariffs are nothing. They're one instrument of economic policy, perfectly legitimate. But of course, I guess Trump goes into this with his. I wouldn't call him a classic industrialist or entrepreneur. He's a businessman. He's a by upbringing, he's a deal maker. And of course, that self-confidence by just putting things out and getting through them. And then if they don't work, you try something else. I mean, that has served him well and does serve him well. And the resilience of Trump is amazing. I was there at both inaugurations, and the schedule our president, our president had in those few days when I was there, it would have tired me, and I'm almost 20 years younger. I mean, he's a force of nature, for sure. I mean, the last couple of months, we've seen things that are not so easy to make sense of, but certainly, and he refers to William McKinley as a lot with his tariff policy. And McKinley, of course, was the president when the American empire really took off. I mean, he was the first president of empire. So, I mean, there's parallels there too. So, but of course, that tariff move probably ushers in the final dismemberment of the European Union, which I would not be too sad about, but who knows? Yes.
So can I just ask a little follow-up question before we go to Father Mario? Because while you're sketching out your scenarios, you mentioned for the future of the world economy and world politics and the civilizational landscape, you said we're going to have probably this bipolar structure with America and China being the comprehensive pools. But still, you said it would be great if Europe could have something of its own zone. Maybe we're not a comprehensive pool, but we have something of our own zone. But from what you're saying about the European Union, it's definitely not the European Union that's going to create the foundation of this zone. Well, of course, there were always 3 very much opposed concepts of Europe. There was the Europe of nations as a free trade area. There's a British concept. And let's say with informal British structures running the thing. I mean, so what can you say? There was the intergovernmental concept of France,
which France, through better diplomacy, could dominate, which we have essentially. I mean, that's the French. An AfD member of the European Parliament once said the European Union is a French custom-tailored suit, which is a good saying, I would say. And there was the German notion. I mean, this was what my dissertation was about. The German foreign policy doctrine after 45, after 48 was always, there were no national interests. I mean, national interests, you said in the same breath, you said European integration and NATO. That were, I mean, they were identical to. I mean, so we got brainwashed to not think about national interests in any way, except by mentioning those first. And so the German idea that would have worked would be a truly federal European Union, subsidiary, but I mean...
Oh, wait, so that would have worked.
Well,
But it cannot work.
No, it cannot work because the French didn't want it and the Germans didn't have any strategy for it. And the last thing they gave away was the D-Mark, which was the last bargaining chip on the table. So, I mean, if Europe is to work, it actually has to be federal, but I don't think it will be.
So
it has to be federal, one person, one vote, which we don't have. I mean, Cyprus and Malta have, 60 times the vote per person than Germany. For the parliament, so it's highly unequal. The parliament is not a full parliament. It would have to be subsidiary, so pretty much like the old federal republic, you have cultural independence, cultural policy, inner policy, all this on the national level, but you need, of course, tariff policy, defense, you need some kind of European structure.
Yeah, this is fascinating. So despite your, bad boy reputation now in the German public sphere, you're actually at heart a disappointed Europhile.
Well, we are Europeans, and I would think Europe has different interests than the US. I mean, we're close, but Europe has to. I mean, if nuclear bombs go off in Germany, which was NATO planning, and Germans would have been happy to participate in those plans. I mean, my friend Willy Wimmer, who was a Undersecretary of Defense in the Kohl era, actually told me that when there was this exercise and when pilots were supposed to drop bombs in Germany or in Eastern Germany, Kohl withdrew from the exercise, but he was the last one to do so. It would be completely irrational to think that interests are identical between Washington and Europe. I mean continental Europe. So, but as I see a highly dysfunctional Europe, which is probably never going to get its act off the ground. So the Hungarian path, or if Switzerland still had its Swiss path, which it doesn't, and Switzerland could be a model, but the Swiss constitution worked well for centuries because it's very decentralized. But nowadays you need a strong central power in the small country to oppose the EU or to find your own way, which of course the Hungarian model now has. So things change over the course of time.
My American colleague, Father Mario.
Thank you very much. And I'm happy you mentioned the parallel to the Roman Empire or Roman Republic. Well, anyway, with the Spengler philosophy on patterns developing, I am always amazed how Germany is always able to rise out of the ashes they did after the First World War, Second World War. Now, I think it's the third, fourth largest economy in the world. The recent military spending, the buildup, with the potential, I don't want to say collapse of the European Union, but let's say its ineffectiveness. Do you see Germany becoming once more the power of Europe militarily? And if so, would that be a good thing for Europe? Or how would the French, obviously the French will certainly not like that, but there's this rise of nationalism, which is growing incredibly in Germany, as I speak as an outsider.
Well,
as an outsider, I don't. But at least, let's say, within the populist parties. Let me refine that a bit. Okay. Do you see Germany taking once more control of Europe, more or less? And when I mean control, I don't mean literally, but financially, or let's say becoming the European hegemon.
Germany.
Sorry, just if I can add, Herfried Münkler in his term.
Herfried Münkler, yes.
It completely fits with that because I think his term from the Macht in der Mitte to transformation of the power is quite an interesting evolution. Sorry for jumping.
So Germany had a completely different system. We touched upon this, like Chinese and the US nowadays. And had the Allied powers had their way after the First World War, of course, there wouldn't have been a resurgence. So, I mean, really with the Ruhrkampf, when the Ruhr area was occupied and other parts were occupied, the early 1920s, but then, of course, there was this resurgence in nationalism, fascism afterwards, which, National Socialism is not fascism, but we won't get deeper into it. So, but after 1945, the hardware was partially gone, not in the West, because production was highly decentralized. So the war economy, the machinery was pretty not. The cities were destroyed, but the production capacity was actually highest in 1944 when Speer took over. So the hardware was partially destroyed, but the software was there, despite of the huge losses of men and so on. But we had brilliant education, we had work discipline, we had all this. And there was this, we're going to show it to them economically. Of course, there was re-education on an ideological sphere. In school, I learned about Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. I didn't learn about Frederick the Great or Bismarck, not much. So I'm an autodidact, you could say, in that sense. So there was, the software was still pretty intact. The East Germany also had the problem, of course, that their brains left to the West. So plus the Russians took a lot of the machinery. So East Germany was quite strangulated and handicapped. But would I think a strong Germany would help to unify Europe or would be a good thing? Yes, but so for example, before the euro, we had an informal eurozone. The Austrian National Bank, the Swiss National Bank, the Belgian National Bank just did what the Bundesbank did, voluntarily, because it made sense. So in that sense, but German diplomacy, Bismarck was a brilliant diplomat, but he did everything by himself. But from then until today, the Kaiserreich, it was deplorable. It was no match to British diplomacy in any way, by any measure of magnitude even. So would I hope for it? Yes, but it's the same as with Europe. It will not happen because Germany is, the software is gone, the education system is in steep decline. I still see some people, let's say, born in the 70s, even in the 80s, that have the old spirit. I'm surprised that there's quite a few left, but I see it with my kids. They're 23, 22, and 10. We'll see. My daughter, fortunately, now chose philosophy, and she's somewhat slightly wokish, but she, at least when she started, finally she started to learn Latin, which I told her I was separated, so I told her do Latin in school. Her mother told her French, so she took French, of course. Now she's taking Latin. She's reading the original philosophers, so there's still some of that. But I think we have to have complete economic collapse. And the question is, if we can do something then out, something European, some European cooperation, or if we will be totally integrated in the US sphere of influence and then just take our orders from there, as most of our politicians do right now. So it doesn't look good for Germany. Thing is over.
Philip.
A more limited question on Germany. So at the moment, they're trying to do a switcheroo at the ECB. The French are trying to maintain power by replacing Lagarde with another French economist. It's pretty obvious why they're doing that, because France is bankrupt, and the only way that they can maintain their public finances is to keep control over the ECB.
So what do they want to do?
They're switching Christine Lagarde out for, I can't remember the name of
For another French?
For another French
Yeah,
economist.
I mean,
That's as of
this
yesterday.
is one of the rules. Sorry to interrupt. I mean, there was an iron rule that never could a German be head of the ECB.
Well, they're really intent on it now. Previously, Draghi obviously was there, and he was head of another. He was previous prime minister of another bankrupt country. The two main bankrupt countries in Europe are Italy and France. So the ECB has become effectively a bailout vehicle.
Yes.
At the same time, there is an enormous push on to issue joint debt, and they're using the Ukraine war as an excuse for this. None of this is long-term sustainable in any way, shape, or form. So a more short-term question, is there any resistance in Germany to this? Any resistance in Germany? Obviously, the Germans used to resist this sort of thing. After Draghi got in charge of the ECB during the debt crisis, the Germans kind of went into retreat. I know there was the Constitutional Court ruling and everything like that, but do you think that there's a chance that as the monetary stuff at the ECB and the joint debt issuance gets more and more momentum, is there any forces in Germany that are going to push back on this?
Well, I thought the Bundeskanzler is opposed to it, right? Isn't there a government providing the opposition?
The Bundeskanzler is opposed to something at some point, and then he's for it, and who knows? And he's a BlackRock man.
It depends how the war's going in Ukraine on a given day.
Yeah, he's a BlackRock man. So, I mean, he's confused a bit, but basically he knows where to take his orders. So we'll see. I mean, I've known him for a long time. We're from the same region, and we have an intense mutual dislike.
Oh. Okay. Well, I wish we, So I wish we could end on a more positive note. Oh, sorry, you wanted to...
I have to answer this first.
Oh, excuse me.
It was a question.
Excuse me. So sometimes people do ask questions. No, you did. Of course, the opposition there is within the AfD, and the founding moment of the AfD was the Euro bailout, because there was a clear constitutional breach, a clear breach of German DNA, of German financial practices. And that's what got the AfD off the ground. And it was called the Professors' Party at first, because it was all founded by basically economics and law professors. And still it was branded populist, but it was very much an intellectual thing and a very principled thing. And then after Merkel's opening of borders, it became more populist and more also nationalist, in the sense that it became patriotic. And only then got I interested in it, because I thought the purely intellectual, economic approach without emotion, without a broader public, popular appeal would not do. And so, but even within the AfD, of course, there's people who say Dexit, and Dexit could be done. I mean, if you really wanted to do it, you have a parallel currency. I mean, there's technical ways of doing it. But even within the AfD, of course, it's the contest's topic. One doesn't want to go too far ahead to take too many risks. So there is, to answer your question, there's no significant opposition to this. So I hope we crash soon with the new regime, and then we see what happens after that.
Oh yeah, so I was waiting for that positive note to end on, but this is a Spengler. This is Spengler event. It's the decline of the West, the Untergang des Abendlandes. So we're going down. Thank you very much. Please give a hand of applause to Professor.
Well, thank you very much for the spirited discussion, and that very deep and very also complex and varied discussion, many topics. So this was an intellectual feast for me, and one I don't have so often. So thank you.
Thank you.